Australians have to country, place and culture. So our colloquium today is being presented by Krista Fisher, and many of you in the room and on the call know Krista well. For those who don't, encourage you to get to know her because she is a fantastic human. Thank you for the chance for this special guest appearance. So I used to work at Orygen until recently. I don't know if I introduced myself. My name's Simon Rice, and I'm now the Global Director of the Movember Men's Health Institute. By way of brief introduction, Krista was the first recipient of a Movember scholarship, and Krista, by virtue of that, became the first PhD candidate to come to the Young Men's Mental Health team. So it's fantastic to see that pathway realised, and Krista presenting her work today. Back when Zach Seidler and I interviewed Krista for this scholarship, we were floored because she rocked up with a few pieces of A4 paper, and on those pieces of paper were two completely different, fully fleshed out proposals for PhDs, and it just goes to show the level of dedication and preparation that Krista has put into her work. So I'll hand over now to Krista to take us through, and we'll look forward to some questions and discussion at the end.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Simon. It feels pretty surreal, to be honest, to be here with you all today, having seen so many PhD students do their completion seminar before me and thinking, wow, it must be so exciting to get to that point. So I'm really trying to be present in that feeling today. I think, like so many PhD students and Masters Bioresearch students can attest to, one of the biggest questions that I've had over the last 4 years when I talk about what I'm doing and that I'm doing a PhD is always, why young men's anxiety? And then closely followed with, and what have you found? Have you fixed it? Have you solved it? So that's what I want to do today. I want to take you through a bit of a journey of what the last 4 years have been like, starting with kind of an update of where the field was at to date before I started in 2020, and then how the key research questions of my thesis are identified, finishing off with some findings, and then leaving us all with a call to action for what the future research agenda of young men's anxiety should really be like. So in terms of how I picked this topic and where my interest in this really sparked from, was diving into some of the global prevalence rates in anxiety disorders and realising that men were half as likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder relative to women. And where we see this split really differentiate is in our youth and adolescent cohort. And researchers have considered what might underlie these differences from a range of different biological, hormonal and neurological perspectives. So looking for things like brain structure differences or hormonal reactivities that might predispose females to developing anxiety disorders. But what they hadn't considered as much was the role of gender socialisation. So that being the way that men and women are socialised to embody and enact those roles and expectations associated with their gender. So traditionally, men have been socialised in Western cultures to embody norms of traditional masculinity. So there's ideals that men are expected to be strong and stoic and emotionally restrictive. And whilst in today's society, the multitude of masculinities is certainly changing, those traditional norms and expectations are still very pervasive. And for young men in particular, we see an increased adherence to these traditional norms. So feeling like that's, I guess, the mould of masculinity that they have to aspire to. And where we see these traditional norms really perpetuated and extremely pervasive is on social media. So those ideas that men should toughen up or face their fears, whilst we hadn't considered this in the literature, for me, I was thinking it makes sense that there would be a significant association here with the way that young men experience and express anxiety. So I want to also paint a bit of a landscape of what the global health outcomes of young men are in Australia. So we can start to see the past research that has explored how those masculine norms, or traditional masculine norms, impact other health outcomes to get a better idea of where anxiety fits in all of this as well. So 42% of young men strongly agree that men should act strong even if they feel scared and nervous inside. 1 in 4 young men say they wouldn't ask others for help for personal problems. 2/3 of young men have experienced some form of bullying in the last month. Relative to young men are less likely to recognise mental health symptoms in themselves and others. Suicide accounts for 1 in 3 deaths in Australian men aged 15 to 29. 1 in 5 young men have had thoughts of killing themselves at some point in their lives. Young men are the highest users of illicit drugs in Australia and experience more than double the health impacts of young women. 1 in 3 meet the criteria for risky drinking. 1 in 3 have engaged in potentially dangerous activities whilst intoxicated, including going to work, driving a car and swimming. Young men spend an average of 2 hours online every day. And almost half of young men in Australia watch porn once a week and 12% watch porn daily. So I think what I was hoping to do by showing this to you all is just paint, a broader picture that what we know from the prevalence rates of mental disorders in men don't necessarily tell the whole picture. So there's a lot more nuance and complexity going on here. And in terms of anxiety specifically, what we know is that anxiety can lead to other deleterious mental health outcomes across a lifetime. So it's been defined as a gateway disorder, and this term has kind of come about from cohort studies that have found that anxiety disorders tend to be the first psychiatric condition that really manifests before other deleterious mental health outcomes in the longer term. And anxiety has also been found to be a unique risk factor in later suicidal ideation, depression, and fatalities. So it's certainly not just anxiety, which can kind of be a perpetuated stereotype that we see where it's dismissed as not as serious as other mental health conditions. So this really kind of starts to narrow in on where I wanted to focus with my thesis. So what the key research questions and aims of my body of research was. That being that firstly I wanted to look at what do we actually know about men's anxiety. So what qualitative and quantitative evidence exists in anxiety disorders and anxiety symptoms, which really started to frame where the other 3 research questions came from. That being, how do young men specifically experience anxiety? What are their pathways and motivations to formal help seeking for anxiety? And lastly, how do young men themselves engage with health services? So I skipped past that slide, but it was really about evidence, experiences, help seeking and engagement. So a big kind of broad scope of the thesis, but something that made significant contributions to a very limited evidence base currently before I started. So to address the first research question, I started with a systematic review. And for those who don't know, a systematic review is considered like a gold standard in research. So the aim is to condense all papers on a particular topic and then distill some of the findings to really be able to extract kind of key evidence related to the certain topics that you're looking at. So I was interested in men's experiences of anxiety, how they seek help, their coping behaviours and strategies, and also to I guess, identify whether there was a role of masculinities here. So in terms of the results as well and what I found, there was early evidence for a male type anxiety phenotype. So that was really looking at, well, for men in particular, they were reporting high rates of psychosomatic symptoms, So things like headaches, nausea, body tremors, aches and pains, loss of appetite, things like that. And associated high levels of shame and guilt as well, attributed to their anxiety symptoms. In terms of coping as well, men were much more likely to report opting for problem-based coping strategies relative to women. And those problem-based strategies were more around trying to find solutions or search for information relative to the anxieties that were going on for them. And the evidence base for experiences and coping was really largely based on sex differences or gender differences work. So the findings that were related to men's anxiety all came about from the ways in which they were different to females. But where there was, I guess, a broader base of evidence was around help seeking. So that evidence started to identify young men as a critical subpopulation here. Young men had a tendency to opt for self-reliance or informal support over seeking help through formal mental health services for anxiety. And some of the reasons that they put forward for that, for instance, was around concerns of confidentiality or stigma and judgment from peers, but also more worryingly, a lack of understanding of what anxiety disorders were or the help-seeking options available to them. And lastly, in terms of the role of masculinity here, there was quite a lot of evidence that men's adherence to traditional masculine norms did impact and influence the way that they were experiencing and expressing anxiety. So they attributed high levels of failure, self-blame and powerlessness to the experience of anxiety. So those sentiments of that they were somewhat to blame for the anxiety symptoms that they were experiencing. But also critically here, there was a cost to one's masculinity as a result of experiencing anxiety symptoms, or they perceived that to be the case. But largely overall, one of the key takeaways here was the lack of qualitative evidence. So there had been no studies that had spoken to young men themselves about what anxiety symptoms and disorders were like for them, which had meant that the field to date was really based on biological determinism and a lot of assumptions around how men experience and express anxiety without hearing from young men themselves. So that was, I guess, the critical next step that I wanted to take with my research, is going out and speaking to young men about what anxiety is like, how it manifested, and how it might change over time for them. And so how I did this was I wanted to undertake a grounded theory study. And what grounded theory research is it's particularly common in phenomenon that we might not have much evidence in. So young men's anxiety was primed for something like this, where you build a theory grounded in the participant interviews. So you speak to them first and then start to distill and extract the findings. So I recruited 25 young men, aged between 15 to 25, from social media and also from Orygen governed headspace centres, because I wanted to hear from guys who both had and had not sought help for their anxiety. So the eligibility criteria for the study was that age range, as well as a young person identifying as male, but also if they self-reported or had a diagnosed anxiety disorder. And as I mentioned, it was, I think, a key strength of this study in that 20% of the sample had actually not sought help for anxiety previously. So in some cases, I was the first person they'd spoken to about their anxiety. And to do justice to the aim of this study, to really bring young men's voices to the fore, I want to show you a video that I made to start to translate some of the findings that had come about from the interviews and the key quotes and takeaways from participants themselves.
Anxiety starts as something physical. You might notice that you feel bad, but just have no idea that it's anxiety.
Over time, anxiety occurs in more and more situations, eventually it totally consumes the way that you see the world.
Hanging out with friends seemed like an impossible task.
It's difficult to escape the negative thoughts in your head.
Telling you that shouldn't be feeling like this, or that you don't fit in.
You compare yourself to friends, brothers and dads who never seem anxious.
Sometimes it feels like the only option is to numb the pain and run away.
So these models and actors in the video were not necessarily, or they weren't participants of the study, but friends of mine who had agreed to take part, so you might recognise some of them. But really what this study was about, and the main outcome of this, was that I generated the first, world first theory of young men's anxiety, which I called resisting, reckoning, responding. And it details the three discrete yet interconnected phases that young men go through from the initial onset of anxiety in the resisting phase and then through to responding. So initially, young men kind of spoke about noticing these physiological or psychosomatic symptoms, but having no real awareness or understanding that that was associated with anxiety. So they were noticing these really distressing or uncomfortable symptoms, but tended to avoid those symptoms arising. So things like distraction or denial. And what young men really reflected on in hindsight was the role that normalisation played here. So in terms of the ideas that I guess get perpetuated in our society around everyone's anxious and everyone has anxiety. So the seriousness of the symptoms that they were experiencing didn't really match or marry up with, I guess, their ideas of what anxiety was. But also the significant role of masculine norms here, being that young men kind of perceived an invisibility of anxiety in their male role models. So they kind of felt like their dads and brothers weren't experiencing anxiety. So it wasn't something that men or themselves would ever kind of experience. So I'll share with you a participant here, Luke. One of his quotes was, "I think it's been around a lot longer than I've been able to identify it. I didn't really have a term for it at the time, so I just didn't think about it." But ultimately, what started to happen is that young men described their anxiety symptoms as diffusing. So they happened in more and more contexts, places where they'd never had these anxiety symptoms arise before. And that forced an introspective and retrospective process of meaning making, where young men then started to look back and look within to develop their own literacy and language for their symptoms and experiences. So a participant here, Nick, says, "It wasn't until I had a full emotional response that I could even acknowledge that it was that bad. And it just didn't make any sense. It was quite scary. And just thinking about what caused it, it was nothing and everything at the same time. So that was really confronting." And lastly, what young men spoke about is that through that process of meaning making, a lot of them then reached a place of acceptance. So starting to see anxiety as something that would likely come and go in their lives, but it was amenable to intervention through both formal and informal supports through their family and friends, should they be open to and ask for it. And in that process of acceptance, a lot of young men also spoke about reframing some of those masculine and cultural norms, which had kept them locked in that resisting phase. So a participant kind of spoke about, initially they'd seen courage as really an absence of fear or worry. But in going through their own anxiety experiences, they started to see actually being able to sit in that anxious distress or put your hand up and say that you need help. That was a more truer form of courage in their mind. And in this process, in this responding process, young men also spoke about developing more adaptive coping strategies to manage their anxiety symptoms when they arise. So things like exercise and socialising with friends, even through to meditation, journaling, all of that really helped them to feel equipped to manage anxiety symptoms when they arise. But just important to note here that it wasn't necessarily a linear trajectory or journey. So in times where anxiety symptoms exceeded young men's perceived ability to cope with it, they then often described reverting back to those more maladaptive or avoidant coping strategies. So participant Sean says, I agree that you have to be tough in life and you have to get up and all of those kinds of things. But part of that is just being brutally honest and open about how you're feeling. So I think really being a man or being a tough person is about just being straight to the point, being blunt and not hiding anything. So through this study, I was able to get a much better understanding of young men's experiences and that trajectory that they go through from initially kind of noticing anxiety symptoms through to then starting to respond and take control. But where I really wanted to focus for this third study was around the actual instance of help seeking. So I guess following on from calls more broadly in the men's mental health field, which had kind of called upon starting to focus on the actual drivers and motivations that bring men into help seeking and help services, rather than just following on or perpetuating this outdated stereotype that men just don't seek help. So how I did this was that I used data that had already previously been collected in a survey with 2009 Australian men who had sought help, asking them about their reasons for help seeking. So of those 2009 men, 419 had selected anxiety as their reason for help seeking, and then in a follow-up open text box in the survey, we'd ask them to describe those reasons for help seeking. So again, through qualitative methodologies and thematic analysis, I looked at all of those responses and started to try to identify themes here. So 3 themes came out of these survey responses. That being that there were initial tipping points which kind of tilted men towards the possibility of ongoing formal mental health support. So they spoke about interpersonal relationship problems or breakdown, vocational and occupational stress increasing in their lives, and also touched on more comorbid mental health issues that were going on for them. So depression, substance use, suicidality as well, which kind of created more broader problems for them. So these are a few participant examples. One 26-year-old says that he was having issues with his partner at the time, a lot of built up anxiety and uncertainty about why he was struggling with it. A 37-year-old kind of explains that he couldn't sleep at night due to worrying about work and long term about whether he would be able to provide for his family. And so the second theme was around more reclusive causes and consequences that were happening here. So the increasingly burdensome anxiety symptoms started to propel these ideas that men were failing to meet their own internal expectations and broader social pressures, which continued to kind of feed off each other. So some examples of this here, a 55-year-old says that when his worries prevented him from sleeping at night, he couldn't relax, and then that caused his health to deteriorate. And another quote here, just the 29-year-old participant who touches on those broader perceived failures around the social pressures and internal expectations. So he says, I hated everything about myself. My weight, my dick size, my lack of masculinity, my sexuality, my habits, my personality, everything. And what started to happen is, as these causes and consequences converged, they propelled men towards help seeking through both defeat and defiant pathways. So defeat pathways were men kind of seeing help seeking as a last resort, so that their ability to cope on their own was failing, and really they didn't have any, or they felt like that was really the next and only step for them to take. Whereas the defeat pathways were more men seeing help seeking in an optimistic light, so feeling hopeful about the potential benefits of therapy, and finally being able to take control and hopefully alleviate some of the symptoms that they were experiencing. And in terms of the actual help seeking context, men kind of described in some instances it being quite a solitary experience, so wanting to do it for themselves, to better themselves, whereas other men were kind of more broadly talking about it as a social, more of a social thing for them. So that either their partners or family and friends have noticed changes and prompted them to seek help, or their health professionals as well might have noticed changes and done a referral or something like that. So a 42-year-old respondent, says anxiety arising from changes at work, and he didn't verbalise those concerns, which ended in him yelling at his wife during an argument about something trivial and unrelated. And he says the look on her face was enough to seek help. And so in this last study, while I was wrapping up the Pathways to Help Seeking paper, and I'd already done the interviews with young men themselves, I came across a report that had been released by Turning Point, which is a research and clinical centre in Victoria. And Turning Point run a project called the National Ambulance Surveillance System. And in this report, what they were looking at is men's mental health related ambulance attendances. And for me, as I was reading through, I think one of the big takeaways there was seeing that anxiety related ambulance attendances were actually the primary thing that paramedics were seeing in broader mental health related attendances. So I reached out to the team at Turning Point and asked if they'd kind of explored that in a bit more depth, or whether they had any context around what these anxiety presentations involved, what they looked like. And Turning Point didn't, but they were keen for me to come on board and to look at that as my last study. And so within some of the broader work that has been done in emergency medical services and ambulance services, anxiety is kind of talked about as a prominent presentation that they see. So anxiety services to me seemed like a key kind of healthcare setting that I wanted to explore, and understanding young men in particular, their patterns of engagement with ambulance services. So I've talked a little bit about the NAS, but just to note here that what the team have been able to do was some really important quantitative work. So what their focus had been to date was looking at population-wide trends and being able to feed that back in real time to our broader health organisations here in Australia. But what I was interested in for the key research question of this study was being able to use qualitative and quantitative methodologies to bring young men's individual experiences to the fore. So actually going into the paramedic notes related to an anxiety attendance and having a look at what was going on here. So the key aims of this study were to look at the clinical characteristics of young men's anxiety presentations, as well as more broadly the context of them. So what was actually leading young men to reach out to emergency services? So what more broadly was going on for them? And as I mentioned, this was a mixed method study, so I utilised qualitative framework analysis to firstly code and identify clinical characteristics in their presentations, and then converted this to a binary data set, which allowed me to undertake hierarchical cluster analysis to identify typologies. So that being, I wanted to look at groups, or whether groups did exist in the types of presentations that were coming through here. And then once those groups had been identified, I then dived back in with thematic analysis to look at the notes again and distill those particular findings for each group. So in terms of the data that I extracted from the NAS, it's the National Ambulance Surveillance System covers data from all Australian ambulance services, but given the scope of data that they would have, I just wanted to look at the Victorian arm. So I extracted all anxiety-related ambulance attendances for males aged 15 to 25 between the timeframe 1st of January 2019 to 1st of January 2020. Just noting here that COVID would likely have had quite a big impact on the nature of those anxiety presentations, not only in the policy changes which affect how people were engaging in health services, but also probably the high rates of health-related anxiety that would be attributed to that time. And so that resulted in 749 anxiety-related cases, of which 55 were recurrent presentations, so men presenting multiple times with anxiety to ambulance services. So in those instances, I took their first anxiety-related presentation and included that in the sample. So there were 696 young men who met the criteria for this study. So this is a bit of a background of the demographic variables of the study. Of the participants, just noting that most from the metropolitan residents, and also that 33% of those 696 young men actually weren't transported to hospital. So either because they refused or didn't want to be transported to hospital, or because following the presentation, treatment was no longer required. And so what the clinical characteristics looked like, this figure presents a kind of a broad macrophenotype of those clinical characteristics across the entire sample. So psychosomatic symptoms were the most common clinical characteristics seen here. So that being body aches and pains, nausea, headaches, all the way through to the more severe end of fainting and loss of consciousness in some acute situations. And also that there was quite high levels of involvement of alcohol and drug use as well. And also that men were sometimes describing social stresses that were going on in their lives to the paramedic during the attendance. And these were non-discrete clinical characteristics here. So one young man might have only had psychosomatic symptoms coded, whereas another one might have had psychosomatic symptoms, alcohol and drug use, and social stresses, for example. And so once I had that coding framework for the type of clinical characteristics that I was seeing, I then used hierarchical cluster analysis to group young men together based on similarities in terms of those clinical characteristics that were identified in their presentation. So the first typology or group here, I called psychosomatic anxiety. So for them, their anxiety presentation involved a sudden onset of psychosomatic symptoms, with a lot of uncertainty around these symptoms and fear that they might be experiencing something physical or life-threatening. Whereas in the second group, their anxiety was more related to alcohol and substance use. So increased alcohol and drug use either had precipitated or perpetuated their anxiety symptoms. So in some cases, anxiety symptoms were arising from recent drug and alcohol use. But in other cases, young men were kind of describing to paramedics that they used substances as a way to cope with anxiety. And there were also quite concerning behavioural changes here in these presentations. So that included agitation, aggression, and occasionally violence, which was described by either the paramedic in the attendance or their social supports at the time. And lastly, our complex anxiety group, they had more significant deteriorations in their mental health. So their presentations often also included self-harm and suicidal ideation, and behaviours, and their anxiety issues were really amplified by broader situational stresses going on for them, which might include a relationship breakdown or sudden loss of work, unemployment, financial stresses and housing issues as well. And this figure is a heat map of the typologies here. So this goes to show once all of the young men were split into those groups, it displays the percentage of cases within each of the group with the clinical characteristic present in their presentation. So as an example, all the young men in the psychosomatic anxiety group had psychosomatic symptoms coded in their presentation, and same for the anxious substance use group, which is what we would expect. But the other more variable clinical characteristics were interesting to note here as well. So to explain these typologies in a bit more detail, I want to present dummy cases for each of the typologies, which is an amalgamation of the types of paramedic notes I was seeing in these groups. So firstly here we have Adam, and Adam is a 20-year-old man who was driving home from work today when he had a sudden onset of shortness of breath, followed by chest tightness and discomfort. Adam pulled over to get some air, and while sitting on the side of the road, reported bilateral tingling and numbness in his arms and legs. Adam became progressively more worried about his condition, and shortness of breath progressed to hyperventilation, stating to paramedics that he thought he was having a heart attack. Adam flagged down a bystander who called 000, and on attendance, Adam was very distressed and emotional. VSS and ECG were all normal, indicating no cardiac abnormalities, and reassurance was provided, and Adam was transferred to hospital. For the second typology, our anxious substance use group, here we have Cam, who's a 15-year-old male, and he became extremely anxious and agitated after consuming half a bottle of vodka in the last 8 hours. Cam's housemate at the scene called 000 when they were unable to calm him down. According to housemates, Cam has also consumed ice, cocaine and benzodiazepines over the last 5 days with no sleep. When paramedics arrived, Cam was extremely anxious, hyperventilating and grabbing his chest, stating that he wanted to go straight to hospital. Cam appeared distressed and teary, but anxiety reduced following reassurance. And our last group, the complex anxiety group, we have Daniel, who is a 21-year-old male and states that he's suffered with poor mental health for the last 18 months with no diagnosis. He's currently awaiting an appointment with a psychologist, and Daniel's mum reports that he's been increasingly withdrawn and anxious over the last 4 days, which Daniel states is due to his partner relocating for work and significant financial strain. Tonight this escalated into a verbal confrontation with family members, as Daniel stated that he just wants it all to be over and planned to kill himself tonight. Daniel stated to paramedics that he's aware he needs help, but doesn't know what to do. Daniel was transported to hospital for appropriate mental health assistance. So they were the 4 studies that I undertook, and I just want to summarise some of those key findings of my thesis as well. So starting with that first research question, in answering this, I undertook the first systematic review in men's anxiety, which really provided early evidence for a male type anxiety phenotype, so that being those high rates of physical symptoms. It also identified the role of masculinities here and pointed to the limitations of sex-based research, also highlighting the low levels of qualitative evidence that was here, but also highlighting young men as a critical subpopulation that required further research and clinical intervention. So in response to the second research question, I developed the world-first theory of young men's anxiety, identifying those 3 phases that young men go through, moving from initially resisting their anxiety to then gaining literacy and understanding in that reckoning phase, and ultimately reaching that place of acceptance and a more broader openness towards help seeking. And that third research question ascertained men's pathways to formal mental health seeking for anxiety, identifying those tipping points which tilted men towards a possibility of intervention, but also showing how those reclusive causes and consequences converge to propel men to ultimately seeking help. And lastly, in looking at young men's presentations in that ambulance setting, I characterise the typologies of young men's anxiety presentations to ambulance services, identifying those three typologies in which young men were presenting, but also developed an innovative four-phase mixed methodology technique, which can also be used to bring the kind of pros of qualitative analysis to big data sets, which can be used in future research studies as well. But if I was asked to summarise my findings in one sentence, it would be that there was evidence for a distinct gendered experience of anxiety in young men, which then led to disparate pathways to help seeking and diverging patterns of engagement with health services. So what does this mean? What do all of these findings, why do all of these findings matter? And really, in terms of research, it showed that young men with a lived experience of anxiety really need to be at the forefront and foregrounded in robust and rigorous quantitative studies, which will hopefully be the next focus of men's anxiety scholarship. But also the need to expand this triple R theory of young men's anxiety to subpopulations or minority populations of young men. So undertaking qualitative evidence with LGBTQIA+ young men and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young men as an example. But in terms of clinical care, it's kind of made a good evidence for the potential benefits of gender responsive models of care. So the benefit of adopting those gender responsive approaches to better identify and treat young men with anxiety. So for example, developing scales which can more accurately identify the male type anxiety phenotype in young men, but also upskilling clinicians to provide treatment that's both needed and wanted by young men themselves. And lastly, there's currently no intervention or public health resources specifically focused on men's anxiety or young men's anxiety more specifically. So there'd be huge benefit and scope in actually creating some gender responsive interventions and resources here, which can focus on targeting the masculine norms and roles which play a significant role in men's experiences and expressions of anxiety. So an example of this could be a public health campaign that actually talks to young men themselves who are experiencing anxiety, shares these lived experience stories, and starts to, I guess, normalise anxiety in men, show all the men that are struggling in the ways that they've been able to take control of their anxiety. And in terms of the overarching strength of this thesis, the triangulated data sources were really important here. So actually collecting primary data through those interviews, through to using or employing secondary data analysis on already existing population and cohort data that had been collected, which ultimately allowed me to look at diverging clinical severities of anxiety. So speaking to young men who hadn't sought any help or didn't feel as if they needed it, all the way through to looking at anxiety in acute and really severe emergency situations. And lastly, that I also employed novel methodologies, so using both quant and qualitative techniques allowed me to gain really nuanced and rich takeaways here. But noting some limitations, so when looking at young men's experiences of anxiety, it's likely that specific sub-diagnoses of anxiety disorders like social anxiety disorder or phobias might have more nuanced experiences here, which I wasn't able to capture within the scope of this thesis. But also pointing to that most of my sample was Australian cisgendered and educated young men. So just the importance of honing in on more minority and subgroups of young men will be an important future focus for the next phase of research. And where to next? That's the next big question. And I want to leave us all with something to think about, outlining what a future research agenda for young men's anxiety could look like. So I think firstly, it's important that we develop some kind of intervention here for young men's anxiety. So this could look like a suite of psychoeducation resources that is specifically focused and targeted on young men's experiences and expressions of anxiety, which could also encompass a male-type anxiety screening tool. So a better way to actually identify those male-type symptoms which were coming through across all of my studies. Step 2 could be implementing this intervention in an ambulant setting. So, for example, once the intervention was potentially embedded into already established and empirically evaluated existing resources, this could then be placed on a referral card, a QR code or something that paramedics could actually give to young men during an anxiety-related attendance or their social supports. This would not only ensure that young men are actually getting the care and education around anxiety that they need in a paramedic setting, which is often so limited and impossible for them to be able to spend that time with young men, but also to upskill the paramedics in anxiety attendance, when often they don't have the many procedures that they can actually help young men during an anxiety episode with. And lastly, step 3 is a need for longitudinal evaluation. So this could not only assess the effectiveness of something like a young men's anxiety intervention, but also start to see health service patterns and changes long-term following an initial anxiety disorder diagnosis or ambulance presentation. And overarching these 3 steps needs to be the continual evaluation and validation of male-type anxiety phenotype and the anxiety typologies that I identified in that ambulance study. So this would allow us to generate a really robust empirical evidence base for the gendered experience of anxiety in young men. And these are some potential ideas of what those research studies could look like, which I won't continue on with, but you can look at the slides should you need them. So I just want to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge and say thank you to so many people who've supported me the last 4 years. I think when I've spoken to past PhD students, they've kind of talked about a PhD as a very isolating experience, but I couldn't have had the opposite experience, honestly. I've been so fortunate to have, firstly, so many friends and family supporting me not only the last 4 years, but 11 years of study, which deserves a call out in and of itself, I think. But also to the Orygen team, the Young Men's Mental Health and Sports Research team. You're wonderful people, and I'm so fortunate that our paths have crossed. I have no doubt that I've got many lifelong friends now to thank for this. But also to my supervisory team, to Kylie and John, for the numerous drafts that they've read, the really constructive and considered feedback that they've given me has no doubt resulted in a much higher quality thesis. And John, I've really admired the way that you've always created opportunities and cultivated opportunities for new researchers in this space. One example being part of the Reducing Male Suicide cluster, which meant that I was able to travel to Vancouver last year for a month, which was truly a highlight of the last 4 years that I remember. And to Simon and Zach, 2 of the most incredible mentors that I could have asked for. They've continued to support me the last 4 years, not only in their brilliance in this area, but also really cultivating such a strong sense of self-confidence and belief in myself that I know will stay with me for the entirety of my career. And to you all today who've come to listen, thank you. And I really look forward to hearing your questions or feedback as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to take over the chairing here because I can see the room and Simon unfortunately can't see the room. I'm Kelly, for those who don't know me. I'm also the chair of Krista's PhD committee, and I've had the pleasure of watching Krista's journey as a admirer, really, Krista, I have to say, and you're just watching you grow and go through the PhD process has been truly inspiring, and I've really, I've learned a lot from you actually watching you go about your work. I'm excited about what's ahead. Now, thank you for that acknowledgement at the end. I just wanted to let people know that all of those people are online, so I don't know if we can show the faces, Rashid, but I'd also like to add a thank you to Associate Professor Yael Perry, who's also joined us online and is part of the advisory committee for Krista's PhD at Yale's at the Telethon Kids Institute and joining us from WA. So it's so lovely to have you all join us online. So give us a wave, everyone. We can actually see you. Yeah, there they all are.
Callie, you're chair of the advisory panel as well, and have been a huge support to me. So
yeah, pleasure, been my pleasure. So do we have, happy for people to put their hand up online. We can keep our eye if there are any online questions, but any questions here in the room? I might start then. Krista, can you talk about if there are any challenges, and just for our own learning, I guess, and my interest in the data collection and evaluation with Turning Point, that collaboration, how you navigated that, how you found out about the data set, just a bit about the nuts and bolts of that, because that sounds like it would have had some hurdles.
Yeah. So how I approached it was that I just emailed them with Zach and Simon involved, obviously, as well, and we set up a meeting with them. And I think probably our approach to it was that we wanted to come in and work with them rather than me saying, I'm going to come in and do all of these things with your data. So I think it was a gentle approach, which resulted in quite a strong relationship with them, and who I'm still kind of in contact with and hope to work with in the future as well and keep those strong partnerships there. In terms of barriers to the actual data side of it, obviously not having collected the data with myself, it was a lot of conversations with the RAs who were coding the data as they came in from those ambulance attendances to understand how those different variables were classified, what the coding framework of that looked like, and also to understand how all of their programs work. Makes sense, but they keep everything on Stadia, and all of the different states are filed separately and everything like that. So I think it was just me coming in with curiosity and kind of an openness to learn from them, which, was the real benefit here, I think. I can't speak for them, but I think they, at the end of it, they had spoken to me about just how great the relationship was, and that they want to look at being able to, co-supervise or facilitate other PhD student projects if they were interested. So, I think it was just looking for an opportunity, being able to reach out with them and working to their terms.
Yeah, thank you. Gary?
Hi. Yes. Thank you. Firstly, Krista, you're amazing. I've always thought that about you. I wanted to ask, in your study where you interviewed young men, did men always have the support of their informal support network when they were seeking help? And was there a bit of a difference in the men that did have that support when they were seeking formal help from their friends and family? Or did you notice that there were some men that kind of had to navigate that in a very isolated way?
Yeah, I think to do justice to the data, more than I thought, more often than I had assumed going into these interviews, young men were speaking quite openly with their informal supports. But what I really noticed was that when I asked young men about who they first spoke to about their anxiety in terms of their friends and family, it was always a female in their life. I think one exception to that. So it was either their mum or their sisters or their partner. And it was, I guess, beyond the scope of that study to get into why that might be, but I think there was more of a comfort around that emotional vulnerability and expression there. So that was an interesting kind of finding. But yeah, some young men also spoke about not feeling like it was anyone else's business or not feeling like they required that support, which, you know, when I guess I undertook that third study looking at men's pathways to help seeking, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think, like, for them to feel inspired or self-empowered to take that step, if that works for them, then we can leverage that and utilise that from a strength-based perspective. But yeah, it was interesting that the ways in which young men particularly sought help from informal supports.
I think we've got time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question? Or two quick ones. Go, yeah.
Thank you so much for a fantastic and informative presentation. I'm just curious where to from here in your career. There seem to be lots of different avenues you can go down. Do you have funding? Yeah.
So I'm very excited that the next step of my research journey is with Simon and Zach. So I've just accepted, well, back in November actually, which is fitting, our research fellow position at November. So I'll be working with them to set up and establish the November Institute, working still really closely with the team at Orygen, which is wonderful and fantastic. But yeah, I think what my research role there will look like is working on big global projects across multiple goals and strategies, still focused on young men's anxiety, but looking at a range of different things that anxiety feeds into. So, for example, more focused in on social media use and sports as a potential intervention for improving young men's mental health, gaming, and also focusing in on those risk factors, so substance use and gambling. So my scope of research will be a lot broader, but I think that'll mean that the impact that I can have will be a lot broader as well. But along with that, anxiety will always be a focus of mine. I think I need to do justice to that field as well and continue with growing that scholarship base out. Sure.
I'll try and make it quick. Also, thank you for important research, and your presentation was immaculate, so thank you. With regard to sort of those future projections, it was really good to see recommendations for that more marginalised groups, like people that are transgender, for example. So my question is more about transgender men that, you know, do you think fit this phenotype that you discuss? And if they do, and in the way they present anxiety, what does that mean sort of for future research and maybe understanding anxiety in trans men?
Yeah, definitely. I think it really needs a PhD in and of itself, to be honest. But my assumption would be that, and I think a strong, evidence-based to that assumption would be that the male type anxiety phenotype was really framed by those masculine norms, those pressures to adhere to traditional masculine norms. So for anyone who identifies as male, they're going to experience those socialised gendered roles and expectations, likely in a different way, and will have nuanced and complex experiences in terms of those gender norms and relations. But yeah, I think absolutely. But the nuance of those experiences really needs to be focused on in and of itself.
Thanks, Krista. If everyone could warmly join me in congratulating Krista. Thank you everyone who's joined online. We're going to go have some lunch. We'll see you soon. There's lunch at the back, everybody. Help yourselves.